Voting by mail does not actually have a partisan effect. It's neutral. It doesn't help Democrats. It doesn't help Republicans. What it does do is boost turnout. And so there is this assumption that President Trump and some other Republicans make this assumption as well, that if more people vote, they are more likely to lose.
I want to ask about the repeated attacks on vote by mail by people, of course, other than by President Trump, by Republicans claiming to be attacking voter fraud. In Georgia, the new Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, has announced an absentee ballot fraud task force to investigate signature mismatches and other issues. In your New York Times Magazine piece, you quote Lauren Growargo of Fair Fight Action, who says the task force is a submission to the Trump voter suppression machine. Explain.
So, yes, in Georgia, I think the concern of voting rights advocates like Lauren Growargo is that people will hear they're going to be investigated if they vote by mail, and they'll get nervous about it, and that will intimidate them in a way that will discourage voting. I think it's also important to connect this to a long-time voter suppression tactic among conservatives. So you go back to the 60s, you had poll taxes, literacy tests to try to prevent African Americans from voting. Then we have the Voting Rights Act. It becomes illegal to do things like that. But you start to see a push for voter identification at the polls. And the justification for voter ID laws was we're preventing fraud. So it turns out there's almost no fraud at the polls. If you think about it, it'd be really hard to turn an election by having people show up and vote twice. You need a lot of people to do that and get away with it. It just isn't really a problem. And so that does not stop conservatives and a lot of Republicans, however, from making this charge over and over again. We're seeing it now with a complaint about voting by mail, even though states like Secretary Griswold, with a really good track record and practically universal voting by mail, have very low levels of fraud. And you also see it with something called purging, which is this idea of cleaning up the voter rolls by cutting people off of them if they haven't voted for a while or if their names don't exactly match in other databases. And similarly, the rationale given for purging the rolls is to prevent fraud. But the reality of fraud is just much, much smaller, really tiny compared to the amount of people who end up with barriers to voting for these reasons.
Emily Bazelon, is the Trump campaign spending its election money on efforts to limit voting by mail?
There is at least 10, I think now it's up to $20 million that the Republican National Committee has set aside for lawsuits relating to the election. No, this is perfectly normal. The Democrats are spending money on lawsuits too, but the Republicans are doing things like challenging an all vote by mail primary in New Mexico, a conservative group challenging a similar effort in Nevada. And then we also are seeing the Republicans just gear up for election monitoring, for their efforts on the day of the election, for the people who do vote at the polls, perhaps to interfere with their right to vote. That is something that has happened in the past. They've been blocked from doing what's called ballot security for many years because of a consent decree they agreed to in the 1980s. But that consent decree will be gone for the first presidential election in 40 years. And so that's another potential for spending this kind of money on.
The military has been doing mail-in voting for what, 200 years?
Well, yeah, it started in the Civil War. You're right. That's where we get the idea of absentee balloting from. There was actually a struggle through World War I and World War II over how much absentee balloting soldiers would be able to do. But yes, they have been doing it this way for a long time.